Hey, good morning, everybody, and happy Easter. I hope you were able to find this okay this morning. I know there was some question about the link and the advertisement, but I see that some of you are here, so it is great to see you. Um, I hope that throughout this time this morning, you will share your greetings, your thoughts, your ideas, especially today. Because Christ's resurrection is all about love of God and love of neighbor and a love that never dies. And so we want to work together on all of these things. I will tell you that this might be the weirdest Easter sermon that you ever hear. Okay? Like ever hear. Unless you watched last year, but it might even be weirder this year. Okay? This might be the weirdest Easter sermon you ever hear because today in person here, the choir cantata is happening. And so I'm only sharing this message with this group online. I know some choir members might watch later, but it's an online group. And I always feel like for the people who attend in person, there's a fine line. I don't know who first said this, but it's a good one that it borders on a hostage situation at times because nobody wants to be the person that gets up and leaves and then stays for coffee and donuts anyway, right? I mean, you can try to tune out words, but you might be stuck there, okay? But online, I know that you can shut me off easily. You can scroll on, you can move on. You could pause it and come back later and listen again. So for some reason, hi Ayers. For some reason, I feel like online with you guys, I can push the bounds just a little bit, push the bounds of thinking. Um, I hope that's true today. If I make you mad, that's okay. Reach out, let me know, and let's talk about it more. I'm preaching with only you guys, online only, next Sunday as well. So this Sunday and next Sunday, I'm pushing the bounds just a little bit. I want to share that about 18 months ago, I had an experience that was so meaningful in my life. Sorry to hear that, Dan. So meaningful in my life that it has changed my perception of a lot of things. Um, Not the least of which is death. Um, I was tempted to talk about this last Easter, but I think it was just too fresh in my mind. I needed time to think about it more, process more, give myself some time before I could talk about it easily. But on October 1st of 2023, my mother died. And I know for many of you, the passing of a parent is a very profound experience. It was for me too. Most, if you know me, you know that. She was clear about her wishes before she passed, though. She didn't want a funeral. She wanted a pizza party for family at her house and cremation. And she was very clear that she didn't care what we did with her ashes. She just didn't want us to spend money on a burial plot and a gravestone and all that. Just, I don't care what you do with them. I won't be here. Do what you want. And so we planned the pizza party, and it was the first weekend of November. And several of us from Minnesota, who are my part of the family, flew down. Several of us, not all of us, could go. And honestly, we had a great time together. The whole weekend was just a celebration, frankly, and that's exactly what my mom would have wanted. But as part of that weekend, we needed to try to figure out what to do with her ashes. And so we made a lot of jokes about it, but ultimately, um, we decided to spread them around the yard of her home. She loved her home and she loved her yard. We moved into that house when I was 5, so that was 53 years ago. Um, and it was such a beautiful yard. In a little bit, I'm going to show you a video of what happened that day, because I want you to see it. I want you to see, you might be able to see what I experienced a little bit with this. And honestly, for me, it was absolutely profound. Because as we were spreading the ashes around her yard, I noticed that, of course, the heavier particles fell to the ground, but the lighter particles went airborne. I want to talk about that today because for some reason I felt at that time in that moment, my mom went airborne. And I can't really tell you what that means. I'm a skeptic. You have to know that about me. I give myself room to question things. Not always have I been that way, but today, now I am. But something happened that day that changed my perception. If you've heard me talk, you know that I allow myself to question things, and I encourage other people to do that too. And I read about and personally know Christians who aren't so sure about all these things, like what happens to us after we die. And also, and I mean sincere followers of Jesus, people really living the life, really living out the call, who are not so sure about Jesus' resurrection body. They're not so sure actually what that was. There are people who believe that maybe it was more spiritual in nature than physical. I know them. I know that they are loving God, loving Jesus, loving neighbor. They're just not so sure about that. I also read about and know Christians personally, again, that are followers of Jesus, that believe that Jesus' resurrection really was more of a symbolic story, a metaphor for how life will always continue when love is the life, that love will always continue, that Christ, the essence of Christ, will always continue. I'm not willing to say that people who hold those beliefs are excluded from loving Jesus and following Jesus, but it's important for you to know that for everybody, that's not necessarily a black and white truth. In fact, I would say it can't be a black and white truth. Ultimately, none of us were there when it happened. None of us were there. See, Jesus' life and legacy was so powerful that it lived on anyway. But there are people who really do believe that a lot of those stories are more metaphorical, symbolic, or maybe spiritual in nature. Now, years ago, these views would have really disturbed me because I was raised like many of you with those creeds, and beliefs that were solid. Christ's resurrection was the most important thing that you had to believe. And you had to believe that because if you didn't believe that, you couldn't go to heaven after you die. And 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 that was something that was hardcore for me, truly. But as I learn more through living my own life and studying the Bible, truly studying the Bible, I can make room to wonder about this. I can make room to ponder it a bit. I can make room to even say that it can't be a fact because none of us were there to observe it and evidence, right? Writing about something isn't evidence of fact. I hope I'm not already scaring you and bothering you. I want to encourage you to stay with me today, okay? I want to briefly look at the resurrection stories of the Bible. Although many people try to meld them into one cohesive story that takes all the parts of the four gospel stories of the resurrection in the Bible to make one story out of that, the Bible accounts of resurrection are very different from each other. And I know I've talked about this probably last Easter. In fact, on Friday night for Good Friday service, I read only Mark's Gospel's version of Jesus' crucifixion, and man, eyes were wide, like holy cow, this doesn't sound familiar to me. And I had to say that yeah, I know it's because we make one story out of the four. This is just one of the stories. Yep. The fact is, there are different accounts of what happened in Christ's crucifixion and also at the resurrection. There are different accounts. And in fact, there are different accounts beyond the four Gospels of Mark. I said that first because it was written first, Matthew, Luke, and John, because there were other Gospels that were rejected when they put together the Bible. One of them was the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, yes, Jesus has a resurrection. There is a resurrection of Jesus' body, and there are sightings, but this gospel is different from the other four too. And then there's another one called the Gospel of Thomas that doesn't include any kind of story narrative about this at all. And I think that's fascinating because the Gospel of Thomas was supposedly written by the guy who put his finger in Jesus' side. We'll get to that in a minute. And yet, Thomas feels no need to write any narrative story about Jesus' resurrection at all. So I want to look at these four stories, and Michael, thank you for sharing that. That's a good article to help you see the differences in the resurrection stories. I want to look at these four gospels that are in the Bible for just a few minutes here, because what we're looking for is if and how Jesus appears. In what form does Jesus appear? And in what form does Jesus appear? Okay. Like, is Jesus recognized or not, which can indicate that Jesus is in a different form. I want you to hear this. In Mark's most original gospel, okay? Oh, Diana, what'd you do? Just one second, you guys. I did something dumb. Hold on one second. There we go. Gosh, Easter Sunday, do something dumb. In Mark's original gospel, and the reason I say that is because there's a section of Mark that shows up in later manuscripts, but not in the early ones. In Mark's original gospel, the first one written of the four, Jesus does not appear at all. Not at all. There are no post death sightings of Jesus at all. This is Mark chapter 16. Basically the story is that Mary Magdalene, Mary, and Salome go to the tomb. They find it empty. They see a young man dressed in white, which is super strange. And let me just go ahead and apologize now for all the white people in these in these images. Jesus was not white. These people were brown skinned in that place and time. Almost all of them had to be brown skinned. But it's very hard to find images in art that depict Jesus as anything other than a white guy, which is really sickening, frankly. So please forgive me for the images. I'm just wanting to make the point here today. And the young man says to them, "Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised." And then he says to them, "Go to Galilee and you'll see him there." And then Mark's gospel ends like this. This is the end of the first story. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The end. That's it. Now, the section that's added later is super weird. You should look at it. It's real weird. hardly anybody talks about it because it includes things like these signs will accompany people who believe, like they pick up snakes. If they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. Uh, did you hear me say that? So, in other words, this is part of where we get that weird stuff that's like snake handlers and I don't know. And they lay hands on the sick and they will recover. So, what's added to Mark's gospel much later is real weird. But nobody really wants to talk about the fact that Mark's gospel ends with no sightings of Jesus. It's just the addition that includes a sighting of Jesus. That's important to know. The first gospel that was written, there is no resurrected Christ body showing up. Okay? I'm going to look at Matthew's gospel. This is in Matthew 28. When they got to the tomb, there was an angel there, and that angel caused the guards to pass out in fear because there were guards guarding the entrance to the tomb, supposedly. I think that's a really weird image, but that's okay. The angel told Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, that's who was present that day, that Jesus was gone. Angel says to them, he has been raised from the dead, and indeed, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him in Galilee. But then, just as they leave, Jesus appears before them, and they recognize him immediately. Suddenly, Jesus met them and said, greetings, even though the angels had told him they'd meet him in Galilee. Okay? And they came to him, and they took a hold of his feet and worshiped him. Okay. And then the story continues. They go to Galilee and they see him again. And then Jesus gives what they call the Great Commission. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, etc., which many people think was added later anyway. But that's the end of Matthew's story. So in Mark's gospel, Jesus doesn't appear at all after his death. The tomb is just empty. And in Matthew's gospel, Jesus appears in a recognizable form. They immediately know who he is. And not to be gross, but I don't know how he walked because there were holes in his feet or ankles or something, but whatever. Some form of healing had to have occurred if Jesus walked in bodily form in front of these people. But they knew exactly who he was right away, and they bent down and they worshiped him at his feet. Okay? That's how Jesus appears, even though it's sort of out of sequence with what the angel said. Very strange. Look at Luke's gospel. A larger group of women go to the tomb in Luke's gospel, and they see two men in dazzling clothes, which is really weird. And these men say to the women, why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. And then they make reference of Galilee, but remember what he told you in Galilee. And so the women share the news, but Peter didn't believe them, so he ran to the tomb to see for himself. And then what happens right after that is this story that we talk about a lot. It's the road to Emmaus. My slide says walk, but it should be road. Road to the Emmaus. That's my fault. It's the story where two people who are named as disciples in the Bible are walking along a long road heading somewhere, and they're joined by a third person, and they do not recognize this person. Now remember, these people were named as disciples, so they knew Jesus, they followed Jesus. These three people walk all day together, they talk all day, and they don't know who this guy is. But when they sit down, they invite him to stay for supper. When they sit down at the table, all at once, here's what the Bible says, then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. So Jesus spent an entire day with two disciples, although he was in a form they did not recognize. Do you see this? In Luke's gospel, Jesus shows up in form that people recognize immediately, and Jesus shows up in a form where they don't recognize him at all. Because right after this story, Jesus shows up in normal form with the disciples and even eats with them, sits down with them and eats with them. But Luke's gospel portrays both. Jesus showing up in a recognizable form and Jesus showing up in a different form that they didn't recognize. Now, some people try to make excuses for why they wouldn't have recognized him, but this is in my notes later, but I'm going to say it now. If I did a funeral for someone, if I worked with somebody for 3 years, even 1 year, and did a funeral for them, and then they walked in my office, I'd recognize them. Okay. That's pretty hard to excuse away the fact that these people didn't recognize him all day. Maybe that's a metaphorical story. Either way, the Bible allows us to have symbolic, spiritual, metaphorical, or different forms of Jesus showing up. The Bible lets us do that. Let's keep going in John's Gospel, written much later than the others, a different approach entirely. Mary goes to the tomb and Jesus is not there. Peter and someone named the other disciple, which is also a really weird thing to do. It makes it sound like it's a story or a parable when they say things like that. Also go there and they end up running a race, which is super strange. Very curious in the story. Mary sees two angels in the tomb and then bumps into Jesus in a form she does not recognize as a gardener. Okay, there's the angels, and here's just an image of this. She does not recognize Jesus at all, and I think it's really strange how they, put the common view of Jesus right here in all the artwork. You can't find a just gardener dude in any images. She doesn't know who he is. She's talking to him and she's crying. He is not in a form she recognizes until Jesus says to her, Mary. And then she turned and said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, which means teacher. Right away, she knows who he is after he calls her name, but not before that. Mary Magdalene would have known who Jesus was. People try to excuse this, like she couldn't see properly through her tears, but she didn't expect to see him, so therefore she didn't see him. But a lot of people are willing to go right ahead and say Jesus was in a different form. Maybe. Maybe it was spiritual, because look at what Jesus says next. This is weird. Do not touch me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. That's what he says to her. So was he touchable? Was this spiritual? What if it was? But then it gets really weird because he gives her instructions to go to tell the disciples and tell them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father and to God your God. So that sounds like the end. So Mary went and announced to the disciples, I've seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her, which is a very strange thing, because then right after this, Jesus does appear to the disciples in a form they recognize immediately. He even allows Thomas to touch the wound in his side. And then there's this thing that seems like the ending to the whole Gospel of John. And honestly, scholars don't know what to do with this at all. It says, right in there, it says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written so you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Sounds like the end, right? But then there's another chapter after that, which is even stranger than the one before. It's the story of Jesus meeting the disciples at the shoreline, and he calls out to their boat and gives them advice on how they could have a better catch, and they don't recognize him at all on the shoreline. And again, people say, well, it was too far away, or they didn't expect to see him, or whatever, right? They don't recognize him until they catch a lot of fish, and then they say, oh my gosh, that must be Jesus up there. So the Gospel of John depicts Jesus sightings like this, twice in a form they don't recognize, and once looking like himself, even with wounds they could touch and put their finger inside. And remember, that was Thomas, who supposedly, we think it was Thomas, we don't know who wrote it. It just says the Gospel of Thomas. May have been a different Thomas who wrote a gospel and includes no story about that at all. So what do you make of that? Does this bother you? Here's the thing. In the 4 gospel stories in the Bible, Jesus shows up in the same form and they recognize him. Although considering the trauma his body experienced, he would have had to experience some level of healing to walk and talk and eat, and certainly. But Jesus also shows up in unrecognizable forms to people who would have certainly known what he looked like. They would have known the tone of his voice. They would have known the shape of his body, even in the dark. And again, some people try to excuse that away, but what if we let it be something we wonder about? Jesus shows up in different ways and in different forms, even in the Bible. Although a lot of religion will tell you flat out that there's only one thing you're supposed to believe, the Bible gives us other things to consider. The Bible itself does. Sometimes in the Bible, the post-resurrection things, Jesus is physical, And at other times, he seems more spiritual in nature. Sometimes they recognize him, sometimes they don't. And then later in Acts 9, Paul has an experience with Jesus. This is where I'm going to go next week. I want to talk more about this because Paul is super important because it's really Paul's theology that developed the church, more so than Jesus, even in many cases. A lot of people believe that. I think you can back it up. I could argue that. Okay. But I want to talk about Paul's spiritual because he even names it later and says his experience with Jesus was not physical, it was purely spiritual. So, what we have really is Jesus showing up in what appears to be physical, a physical form they don't recognize, and a purely spiritual form. Purely spiritual. That had a really visceral impact on Paul. Even in the Bible, Jesus' post-resurrection form is not consistent. See, for some of you, this might be really scary to hear. I understand. We've believed things our whole lives. But for others, this could be the best news today. Because if you're not so sure about the bodily resurrection of Jesus, you need to know that about 33% of people who call themselves believers in the UK agree with you. They don't believe. And there are a lot of writers, a lot of scholars, writers, studiers, believers in Jesus who follow in his ways, who think he was raised spiritually, but aren't so sure his body got up and walked again. You can still believe in Jesus and not be so sure about these things. And I know people who love Jesus and no doubt, to me at all, live their lives in a way that I wish I could be and do. But they're not so sure about this. See, this opens the door for more possibilities and more people if we're willing to wonder and ponder just a little bit. See, the variances in the Bible stories tell us a lot. They tell us that the perception of Jesus' resurrection was even varied back then. And so why can't it be varied now? And although some forms of Christianity have declared the truth about this, not everyone believes everything that they say. And they think that means they can't belong. But they can. You can. So I could ask you today, do you believe... Oops, I forgot to put those words on the screen. I could ask you today, do you believe in the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ? And I could make that the most important thing we talk about this morning. But honestly, I think that might sometimes be just an attempt to assuage our natural fears of death and secure a ticket to an afterlife in heaven. I would say that Jesus' life has more meaning than that. Jesus' love for all people is what lives on. No doubt about that, and I could argue that point. I could maybe even prove that love lives on more than I could prove the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Jesus' life had massive meaning. His love carries on. And love is what will never die on this earth. And that's the same is true for my mom. My mom's life had massive meaning. And her love for me lives on in me. I know that. I know it. And the feelings that I have about her and this afterlife, I don't always know what to believe because none of this is necessarily fact. It's a matter of faith. But I know she believed that Jesus was going to meet her in the space between and take her someplace called home. She believed that she would be spiritually resurrected, that Jesus would take her home. And I believe that for her. But it was this profound experience that I had when we spread around her ashes that I really want to share with you today. I want you to watch this and notice. First of all, do not judge my mom's yard. She had Parkinson's and she didn't accept help very easily, okay? She's very strong, very independent person. But Her yard was beautiful. We're actually in the process of selling her home just like this week, like now, because we had to. But when we spread around her ashes in her gardens, that was where she always wanted to be, really. And so we did that. I want you to notice how, first of all, I want you to notice this first. First of all, my brother is a goofball. We went outside, we agreed what we were going to do, and right away he picked up her fertilizer spreader and said we could do it like that. Honestly, you might think this is really harsh and crass, but my mom would have thought that was hilarious. Okay, so I just had to include that because I don't know if my brother will watch this, but I think that was super funny. But we went on and we went outside together. And my sister had the job of carrying the ashes. Now, these are little snippets of video that mostly Michael took. A couple came from other people, but this is my sister in my mom's yard spreading around her ashes. I want you to notice how the bigger pieces fall to the ground, and yet the dust moves. At first, I was like, oh, this is kind of weird. I'm having my mom's dust in my clothing today. But then it just got so beautiful. So beautiful. And I just kept watching the heavy parts falling to the ground and something about her rising up. My mom went airborne. I believe that. I believe she went airborne. I believe she returned to the earth, and I believe she went airborne. And I don't know where the place that Jesus may have taken her that's called home is, but I think it's here on this planet. I don't know. But that feeling of seeing her. Yeah, Michael, that's got to be you commenting. It was, wasn't it? Michael's my son online. He was there. You saw him at the very beginning, and he took these videos. Thank you, Michael. It was so beautiful. It was just profound. You know, we even goofed around about her swimsuits, and I don't know if you can hear Lauren laughing at different points. There she is. Mom went airborne. I wonder if the early disciples had a sense of this too, that whatever happened to Jesus, he didn't go away. I want to pause right here. We didn't plan this or script this, but at one point when the ashes were all spread out, we just stood in the backyard in a wide circle and just stood quietly. It was just so important and awe-inspiring. We didn't move for quite a while. And I don't think anybody felt any pressure to say or do anything. We could just be in awe of how beautiful it was in a strange way. And you know what's really weird about all of this? Even then, in some weird way, I felt like my mom going airborne was set free. She was set free from a body that was struggling with illness. And she wasn't even stuck in Florida anymore. It was hard for her to ever travel, but she was on the move. She went airborne, and that meant that her presence was wider and broader. And in a weird way, I feel it now. It's as if her presence is more with me now than it was before. Doesn't this sound like a metaphor for the Holy Spirit? Her presence is more with me now than it was before. And this is a weird thing, but this is one of the coffee cups from her kitchen, and every time I use it, I think of her and the millions of conversations we had, especially in her kitchen. I'm starting to also understand why people value physical objects, which, if you know me, you know isn't really my thing. I remember her life and her love, and frankly, I feel surrounded by her now. I feel like she's with me in a way she couldn't even be before. I wonder, I wonder if this story helps you think about this, because I can't prove anything at all about my mom's passing. I can't prove anything at all about Jesus' resurrection either. I can't prove it. But there's something in my heart and soul and spirit that believes that we just continue. And so when the disciples say that Jesus lives on, I believe that too. I'm not sure what form, but I don't think I have to be. And I don't think you have to be either. Whether his body was resurrected or not, his love and his life definitely live on. So I could double down and declare that Christ is risen in bodily form and that that's what you have to believe, but I won't. I'll leave room for us all to wonder. But what I really want you to think about, and I hope you will think about today, even if I scared you a lot, is that the love of Jesus was probably more important than his body anyway. The love of Jesus, the way he lived, the way he healed, the way he moved, the way he taught people, the way he raised people up. This is something I talk about every Sunday. The love of Christ that would sacrifice even to the point of death is a love that lives on. Just like my mom's love for me has changed my life and still is a part of my life and always will be, the love of Jesus has been part of thousands, millions of millions of lives, and will continue, because the love of God is God and always will be. So no matter what you believe about what today is, Easter Sunday, even if it kind of creeps you out just a little bit, because I've heard people say that even this week, or if it scares you that I'm saying that things may not be as certain as we've all been taught and told, and the Bible actually supports that. Whatever you believe about today, here's what I hope you all know. Love lives on, love matters the most, and God is love. God is love. So hang on. Your belief integrity matters. And I'm going to challenge and say the most important thing to believe is that love never dies. Never ever. It won't. Your love for your brother, your sister, your family, your mom, your dad, your children, your love for your cousins, your coworkers, your neighbors, your friends, your community, your love for all humanity will never die. It does carry through to the next generations and the next people. Love does have the power to live on, always, because when you love people, it changes them in a way that has to happen. It matters so much. We know this about human development. Love never dies. It never will. And even if it seems like it dies, it will always rise again. Love goes airborne. Love goes airborne. Love goes under our feet. It goes everywhere. It sprouts up in new ways all the time. And so I'm going to talk more about this next Sunday. I hope you'll come back and listen to my online sermons that are sometimes more challenging than in person. So happy Easter, everyone. Resurrection will always happen on this earth. Always. I believe Christ is risen because love never dies. It can't die. Before you get on with checking your ham in the oven or whatever else you have planned for today, take 4 minutes and just breathe in deep. So happy Easter, my dear friends. Christ is risen because love can't die. Love doesn't die. It will always live on. And the love of God, truly, friends, is the only thing you can count on in this life and the next. Take care, everybody. I hope you have a great day and a great time with family, friends, whatever you have planned, or even just time with yourself. I hope you have a great day today and a great week. I will see you next Sunday and we'll go a little further. Okay? Take care, everybody. Much love to all of you. And again, happy Easter.